notes enough for 2 talks, but I'm going to try to give an abbreviated, about 25, 30 minute thing on atheism. We'll talk about atheism a little bit, and then dive into especially attacks or questions raised by what we would call fundamentalist Protestants, but also by evangelicals. And sometimes those are questions, and sometimes those are attacks. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and then that's going to spill over into week 4. There's a lot of material there, and I suspect that many people, based on what some folks have said, have friends or family members or whatever who are Protestant of some sort. There's obviously a big spectrum, but have had those conversations, right? Why do you worship Mary? Why do you worship the Pope? And it's like, well, we just worship, just whatever that comes along. We just worship it. It's all good. So obviously a lot of questions about Mary and the papacy and a lot of related items. And that's my own background. I came from a very fundamentalist, anti-Catholic background. I'll talk a little bit about that, because really the only topic I know well is my own life. All the rest I'm faking it. So. Well, let's begin with prayer, and let's remember, especially in Rome at the Vatican. Today was the beginning of the summit there with many bishops. I forget exactly how many. I think close to 200 bishops, and the Holy Father working to address in some ways obviously the abuse scandals and various related things. And so I want to pray for our leaders in the church and for the Pope. It's obviously very, very serious stuff. And obviously it raises a lot of questions too, even directly related to this issue of apologetics, as Marshall indicated to me earlier. A lot of people see that as an impediment, understandably, right? So let's pray, and then I'm actually going to talk about that for just a moment. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Father in heaven, we thank you for this time to get together and to contemplate the faith and to consider how we can better defend it and share it with others. And we ask that you would give us wisdom and insight as we consider atheism and consider other attacks on the faith. And we pray also for our leaders as they work to address many challenges within the church. And pray that we will strive always, every day, to be disciples of your Son, Jesus Christ, that we might exhibit the holiness that will attract those who need your truth. We ask these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Saint Peter Damian, pray for us. Today is the feast day of Saint Peter Damian, who was known in his time for addressing a lot of very horrible sex scandals that were going on. And this is, by the way, one of the things that I raise when people say, well, how can you be Catholic when you have all these things that are going on? I'm going to set aside kind of the whole issue of context and proportion, although that's important. By that I mean the fact that, and this is a kind of a delicate topic, obviously, because you don't want to get into this. On one hand, you don't want to get into the temptation of, well, look at these people, because as you might know, for example, the Southern Baptist just came out with a study or report last week. How many have heard of this? Over 300, I forget the exact numbers now, several hundred instances of sexual abuse have taken place. Serious abuse have taken place in just the last 20 years or so. Now, to put that in context and proportion, you have the Pennsylvania report, which is very controversial. There's a lot of debate about some of the contents released about what was going on, and that was over the course of over 100 years. Some of those cases went back actually to the very beginning of the 1900s, and it's actually about the same number of cases. Now, obviously, you don't want to, hey, we're better than the Southern Baptists. Obviously, that's not how we approach this kind of stuff. But I guess my point is, people want to fixate on what's going on in the Catholic Church, and certainly we as Catholics want to. We don't want any of this, obviously. But there are problems almost everywhere, every institution, the public school system, etc. And in a lot of cases, people at large don't want to talk about it, right? So playing the whataboutism card is a delicate thing. But my bigger point is, really, since the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which I would argue is actually the third sexual revolution in American history, by the way. The first really took place in the late 1800s. And I won't go into that, but then the one that people might know a little bit more about, of course, the Roaring Twenties, right? Well, why were the 20s Roaring Twenties? Well, because it was a time of, certainly within certain circles, a time of remarkable hedonism in American culture. And that's what, of course, when you really had more and more people using contraceptives and getting abortions and so forth. And that paved the way in some ways for the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And ever since the 1960s, of course, to put it kind of simply, we've had an unleashing of almost demonic sexual immorality across the board. And I'm not just talking about even just things like abuse of children or homosexuality, but certainly fornication and the use of contraceptives and so forth. So it permeates our culture. We shouldn't be surprised that if we as Catholics accommodate or capitulate to the dominant culture, that we actually act like the dominant culture. That's kind of a given, right? So I think that's something that a lot of people don't like to talk about or sometimes don't think about, but it's a real serious issue. A couple other things in terms of like people bringing up the issue of sexual abuse. For example, once some of these stories started coming out last summer and what's going on with McCarrick and others, I've seen there's been a number of people, high-profile people, have said, I'm leaving the Catholic Church. And my question is, well, so what's the breaking point? Like, is it, that there's 5 bishops who've done something wrong, or is it 10 bishops or 20 bishops? I mean, and I say that not really, I'm not being glib. I mean, what's the point? And the problem here is the church is not ultimately based on a percentage of bishops who are being faithful or a percentage of priests who are being good priests. So by the way, I think the vast majority of priests are good, faithful priests, from what we can tell, I know. It's based on Jesus Christ. I keep coming back to this in terms of apologetics. It's about the person of Christ. So I was saying in an apologetics context as well, we can debate about some of those things, but my faith ultimately is based on the person and the reality of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection especially. And if you look at church history, guess what? There's been problems all along. Because people are people. We are messed up. We are sinners. And G.K. Chesterton in Orthodoxy says there's really the easiest belief, the easiest dogma to prove is original sin. He said all you have to do is walk outside. Look at the newspaper. Right? There's a lot of truth to that, right? Then when you look at the early Christians, read 1st or 2nd Corinthians, for example. The stuff that was going on. Incest, immorality, fornication, on and on and on it goes. Paul's dealing with this constantly, right? It's always been there because sin is always there. And then finally, the thing I point to in relation to the person of Christ is we don't gauge the greatness or the holiness of the Catholic faith by those who go contrary and sin against what the church teaches in following Christ. We gauge it based on the example of the saints, those who actually do live it, right? And so I get frustrated sometimes because people want to fixate just on all the ugliness, and of course we want to address it. But we also want to look to people like St. Peter Damian, St. Mother Teresa, St. John Paul II, et cetera, the holiness, the sacrifice. That's where we really see the essence of what it means to be a Catholic. Okay, that's my little riff on that, and I'm already eating at my time. So I promised Marshall a joke. Yes, sir.
So we're all on an even plane with you when you depart to fundamentalism and as opposed to other Protestants. Can you define for us before you launch in what it means to you and what some of the definition points are when you separate?
When I talk about fundamentalism and so forth?
Right, on the Protestant side.
Oh yeah, when we get to the Protestant section, I want to make a couple of hopefully helpful definitions as to what when I say fundamentalist or I say evangelical, what am I talking about? Because I know for some Catholics, especially if you've been a Catholic your entire life, or you've not been around Protestant circles, it's like, what does that even mean? And it's even further confusing because the term evangelical, say in Europe, means something quite a bit different than it does here in America. So yeah, when I get to that, at about 8:30 or so, when I get to that, I'll cover that. So here's I promised Marshall I had a joke about hell. It's a crowd warmer. So a devout Christian lady is flying, going on a long flight, and she ends up that she's sitting next to a man who's an atheist. And they know this because they start talking, and then she pulls out her Bible to do some Bible reading. So she's obviously not Catholic. And he kind of smirks at her, and then goes back to what he's doing. And then after a while, he's kind of annoyed. He turns to her and says, "You don't really believe all that stuff in there, do you? You don't really believe that?" And she said, "Oh, of course I do. It's the Bible." He said, "Well, what about that guy who was swallowed by the whale? Seriously, come on." She goes, "Oh yes, Jonah. Well, I believe that. It's in the Bible." He said, "Well, how do you suppose he survived all that time inside the whale?" She said, "Well, I don't really know. I guess when I get to heaven, I will ask him." For the proof she's not Catholic, right? Assumption. "When I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah." "Well, what if he isn't in heaven?" the man asks, sarcastically. And she says, "Well, then you can ask him." So I do want to talk about atheism, believe it or not. Because it's, and again, I was talking with a couple of people earlier before we began, why focus on atheism? Well, one of the reasons is because there's a lot of different variations to atheism, and a lot of people would argue today, even if they're not what we would call a hard or staunch atheist, the way that they live their life day to day, they essentially are atheists. They live as though there is no God, without God, even if they would give lip service to God, right? And Gaudium et Spes, which is the constitution from the Second Vatican Council on the church in the world, it's a rather sprawling document, but it has a very interesting section on atheism, very good section on atheism, actually, in terms of defining it and trying to get at some of the points that stand out about the nature of atheism. And it says in Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 19, that atheism must be accounted among the most serious problems of this age and is deserving of closer examination. And so when it comes to apologetics, obviously you have to deal with a lot of falsehoods, a lot of ideas that are wrong, and atheism in many ways is one of the most serious falsehoods of our time. Now, it's kind of disproportionate in the sense that I don't know what the numbers are recently in terms of people who would say I'm an atheist. It's actually still rather low, although it continues to climb, right? People who say I don't believe in God or I don't believe in organized religion, which kind of goes along with that. But it continues to grow. And it also has that kind of a disproportionate influence in that you have, in recent decades, people like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins have published best-selling books. Like God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. And I read his book, and I have to say his book was not great. And by the way, to give it quick, Ignatius Press is a very, very, very talented writer and talented polemicist. But his book is rather laughable in a lot of ways. To give you a quick example, and this is something to think about in terms of how some more popular or new atheists tend to work. Here's this book. It's about 250 pages, and he goes on these rants about different things and how horrible Christianity is and all the evils done in Christianity. Guess how many times he actually has a quote from a Christian in that book? Say 0. That's close, actually. It's a little bit higher than 0. 2. He has 2 quotes in the entire book from Christians. He has a quote in passing from Augustine, which he uses to misrepresent what Augustine believed about sexuality. That's a common one. And then he has a quote from C.S. Lewis. And I forget the context of that, but he has a little quote from C.S. Lewis. That's remarkable. One thing that's remarkable about that is I have a lot of books by Catholics and evangelical Protestants addressing atheism where they have endless quotes from atheists. This is what this atheist says, what they believe is right? So that book, which is a best-selling book, very popular, very well known, that's just an example of how sometimes it's approached, right? And it's very, very misleading. Well, we'll start with a simple question here, like what is atheism? And of course, I think we all recognize it's denial of the existence of God, but it's a little bit more complicated than that in many ways. In Psalms 14:1, you have the famous verse that says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And sometimes this is misrepresented. I think it was last time that I talked a little bit about the nature of the Hebrew or Jewish understanding of the heart, right? The heart is not, in Jewish thought, going back to the Old Testament, the heart is not primarily thought of in terms of emotions, as we think about the heart, right? You know, we talked about this on Valentine's Day last week. The heart in the Hebrew understanding of the world or the human person is the inner sanctuary of who you are, the essence of who you are. It's the seat of your personhood, if you will. And really it's about one's will and one's moral choices. And so atheism in many ways, and I think this goes back to even into the Psalms and to some of these references in Scripture, atheism ultimately for most people is a moral issue as well as an intellectual issue. It's an issue about the will of choosing something, not just about an emotional reaction, although the emotions come in, right? They do come into that. And maybe I mentioned this before, I forget, but Archbishop Fulton Sheen has a great quote. I don't have the exact quote here, but he mentions in one of his books how there's very few people who walk away from the Catholic Church because of some disagreement with the Nicene Creed. You know, I don't believe that about the Trinity or something. Certainly there are cases of that. There's obviously heresies that popped up. He said, but there are plenty of people, countless people who've walked away from the Catholic Church because of the Ten Commandments, right? And I've seen this again and again and again. Last week I talked about Walker Percy, who was an atheist who became Catholic. I was first introduced to Walker Percy by a Bible college classmate, a former Bible college classmate, who we were talking on the phone. This is a few years, like 3 or 4 years after Bible college. We were talking on the phone, and he asked me about Walker Percy. He introduced me to Walker Percy, and I began to read him. This friend, Brooke, was at that time actually studying to be a New Testament scholar, and he was going to school in London. But about 5, 6, 7 years later, he not only had left that and turned and actually got a doctorate in philosophy, he became openly atheist. In fact, we ended up having a bunch of arguments about various aspects of Christianity and stuff. I know for a fact that the problem for him, without getting into it, of course, was moral. It was a moral issue. It was not intellectual. He tried to intellectualize it. We had these intellectual arguments, but it was a moral issue. And I've seen that again and again with people where that's the case, that atheism is embraced because of that. John Cordy Murray was a famous theologian, Catholic theologian back in the 1960s. He was very influential at the Vatican II Council. Said that atheism is never the conclusion of any theory, philosophical or scientific. It is a decision, a free act of choice. The Bible clearly locates the ultimate root of atheism, not in an erroneous judgment of the mind, but in an act of choice. Okay? And I think for an apologist, if you're engaged with talking to an atheist, this is really important, because I think what we try to do with atheists, we tend to think we need to show them how absolutely reasonable Christianity is and give them philosophical arguments. Now, there's a place for that. There is. And some atheists you can have that conversation with. But I think it's important to keep in mind that for most atheists, this is about a moral choice, and this has to do with their grappling with their concept of God, right? I mentioned last week this man by the name of Kevin in Eugene, who I had these arguments with over atheism. He was the head of the founder of the Eugene Freethinkers, what do you call it? Atheist and Freethinkers Society. It may have been just him and his wife, and I don't know how big it was. But we started having this back and forth of about 4 different letters. And in the course of that, I think it was like the 3rd letter, he began to express like this intense hatred towards God, who he portrayed as being incredibly cruel, incredibly vicious. Okay? So here's a quote from him, from this letter that he wrote to me. This goes back almost 20 years ago. He says, "It must be comforting thinking that you're going to heaven, where you can look down at the billions of souls screaming and writhing in pain as their eyes melt out of their sockets over and over again, their flesh constantly consumed by flame for all of eternity, but never dying, all the courtesy of your all-compassionate and loving friend Jesus. Do you find this condemnation the act of a moral God? Eternal pain and torture for some simple, transitory human foible? The capability for which he personally designed into you." I mean, you see all the problems already with what he's saying. God made you to sin. God made you to make mistakes, so it's really his fault. And by the way, it's just if you make any little mistake, he wants to torture you and send you to hell and have you suffer. That's what God desires. If your God were real, I'd throw him in jail for the rest of eternity. What Hitler did is nothing compared to what your supposed God does every day. This is a supposedly all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful being. Why would such a creature bother creating an entire system where the vast majority of his creation will spend all eternity burning in flames? Now, does the Catholic Church ever teach that millions of people, or the vast majority of people, are going to hell? No. In fact, we don't know, right? Obviously, we believe in the reality of hell, separation from that Trinitarian love. That's what hell really is. It's the choice of myself over communion with the Trinitarian God, and we sin in various ways in rejecting that. But what was striking to me, and this is just one example of what he wrote, his belief in God is just as real as mine. Right? You don't go on and on and on about this horrible creature who tortures everybody, they hate him, and he's horrible, and he's nasty, and blah, blah. It's like, dude, if he doesn't exist, why are you freaking out? So he clearly, there's something going on there. And then I later found out what it was. Oddly enough, I discovered another article, and they had a photo of him and more of the story behind him. He had been in a horrible fire in his young adulthood, and he had massive burns and scars. He had been horribly hurt by this fire, a house fire. And he blamed it on God for some reason. I mean, there was this a lot. He blamed it on God. And when you read, what I just quoted there, you see he's making this connection. Somehow God did this to him. It's God's fault. And then this is how he envisions God to be acting. Now, one step further, it gets even more bizarre, because in his final letter to me, after I presented some arguments and pointed out some of these things to him, he actually said to me in the letter, he said, well, I never said that God doesn't exist, just that your God doesn't exist. Like, you're the founder of the Atheist and Freethinker Society. You know what an atheist is, right? I mean, that's like saying I'm the president of the Vegan Society, and this Friday we're having steak. But I didn't say that we didn't eat all kinds of meat, just those kinds of meat, right? So I saw that, it's really interesting, because he began in the first couple letters by trying to present himself as being very reasonable, very rational. I'm the rational person, you're the irrational believer, you don't know anything, you're superstitious. And then by the end he said, well, I didn't say that a God doesn't exist, just that your God doesn't exist. It's like, well, obviously something, is going on. Now that's just one example, that's one anecdote, but I think it's very revealing in that regard. As I think I mentioned, I've only met 2 atheists in my life who I really was convinced they were atheists because they didn't have this antagonism. And one of them was a professor at the University of Oregon. I was taking philosophy courses, and we had some great talks. And he said the most fascinating thing to me. He said, you know what? He said, I wish I could have faith. He said, I do. He said, I have friends who are Jewish and Christian who have faith. He said, I wish I did. He said, I can't. He said, there are times, he said, where I wish, and this is by the way doing he was actually getting his PhD, and he was doing student teaching, and he was doing his dissertation on Nietzsche. But he said to me, he said, you know, there are times I wish that I was living in the medieval era. He said, you know why? Because in the medieval era, people knew their place in the cosmos, and we no longer do. I thought, wow, that's one of the most amazing things I've ever heard, right? And so we didn't really have arguments. We just talked, and it was remarkable to hear that. Gaudium et Spes points out, and actually I should back up here, I think I skipped atheism, about key beliefs. The first key belief about atheism, I want to get through these and then turn our attention to fundamentalism. So I'm kind of just giving a big, and I have some long quotes here from Gaudium et Spes, which I won't get into, but if you haven't, look it up online, Gaudium et Spes, Documents of Vatican II. There's about 5 or 6 paragraphs on atheism. They're actually very, very good. And it goes through and it talks about different forms of atheism. So one of the things that really highlights is the reality of what we will call practical atheism. Well, what's practical atheism? It's where we live, we practice a life as though God doesn't exist, even if we give lip service to somehow there being a God. But we never live as though there actually is a God. Right. That's the problem. You have the atheists who write the books and they do their thing, and that has to be addressed. But the bigger issue is people who live as though God doesn't exist. But then when you talk to them, they kind of will talk about, maybe there's a divine spark or there's a higher consciousness, or so their worldview, going back to last week, is inconsistent, right? I want to just do my own thing. I want to live my own life. But then I also want to live with a kind of the vague belief that after I die or whatever, there might be something. Because it's just too much to think that I die and that's it. It's all gone. So it's kind of their little crutch, their kind of little secret, but they don't want to live as though there actually is an objective, transcendent order and a creator, et cetera, et cetera. So 3 really basic atheist beliefs or premises in general that I think are important for us to know when we are dealing with people and we're trying to defend or explain the faith. First is, of course, the rejection of God, but the other part of that is when you reject God, something has to take the place of God. And what always takes the place of God? Me. Me. The me monster. The worship of man. Right? And that's what you see with people, is that they, in various ways, turn themselves into the center of everything. Or they talk about the human spirit or human progress, or, there's variations on the theme. For example, Gloria Steinem, some of you who are a little bit older will know that name, Gloria Steinem, famous kind of radical feminist. She said by the year 2000, too late, by the year 2000, she said, we will, I hope, raise our children to believe in human potential, not God. The church of human potential. Like, what is that? Believe in human potential. Here's the first question you should have. Potential to do what? What happens is when you look at some of these slogans or phrases, they don't mean anything. Margaret Sanger, of course, promoter of eugenics and an American freethinker who was very big on pushing contraceptives and so forth. Her motto, personal motto, was no gods, no masters. But again, everybody has a god or gods. Everybody does. And everybody has a master to some degree or another. Even if their master is their passions or their proclivities or their sins. Everyone has a master. Right? G.K. Chesterton, who I love quoting because he's like the most quotable person of all time. Atheism, he says, is the supreme example of a simple faith. The truth is that the atmosphere of excitement by which the atheist lives is an atmosphere of thrilled and shuddering theism. Goes back to my point about Kevin. And not atheism at all. It is an atmosphere of defiance, not of denial. And that's what I see again and again. It's not one of denying God exists, but defying God, shaking a fist at God. And then this is a great quote from Chesterton. If there were no God, there would be no atheists. It's true, right? If there really were no God, there would be no atheists. It's quite brilliant. Madeleine O'Hare, so you recognize that name, right? Very famous. She disappeared, but she's the woman who, one thing she's kind of famous for is she fought to get the clause out of the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And then she fought to get "In God We Trust" off of currency. This is back in the 50s and 60s. But here's a good quote from her. She goes, "Atheists live as if there were no God, no efficacy in prayer, and no life after death. We are free from theism." Yeah, you're free from theism, but where does that lead? I mean, what's the goal? Well, ultimately, you have to worship man, or in the case of the 20th century, you worship the state. And where did that lead? You know, anywhere between 60 and 100 million people killed in the name of communism, the state, right? Secondly, atheism, again speaking broadly, embraces materialism, the belief that only this material realm exists, there's nothing beyond it, there's no transcendent reality, and rejects the supernatural, rejects metaphysics. So all that stuff is nonsense. Ayn Rand, who was, she's famous for her politics and her kind of her political theories, but she said that religion is the first enemy of the ability to think. Faith is the worst curse of mankind, as the exact antithesis and enemy of thought. But again, everyone has a religion. If by religion you define what you believe your relationship is to reality. I keep coming back to that because it's so true. Atheists want to pretend that they're free from the strictures that everybody commonsensically knows exist, which is time and space and life and death. We're all beholden to that. Nobody's escaped from those things. Nobody's escaped death, except Jesus Christ. That's for next week, right? And yet atheists want to act as if they can escape from these things, which we look around and we say, yeah, but nobody does escape from those things. We're beholden to the laws and the rules inherent in the physical universe, and which speak to something beyond the physical realm, to what we call metaphysics or the supernatural realm. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is an atheist group, has this quote. It says, "The truth is the degree to which a statement corresponds with reality." That's accurate. That's good. Reality is limited to that which is directly perceivable through our natural senses or indirectly ascertained through the proper use of reason. That's false. Reason is a tool of critical thought that limits the truth of a statement according to the strict tests of the scientific method. And for a statement to be true, it must be testable, falsifiable, and logical. Well, what's the problem with saying that? You can't prove it. You can't prove that's the case. You can't prove that very statement is true. You cannot prove the statement that reality is limited to that which is directly perceivable. You cannot prove that statement is true. Can't get too far into that, but that's one of the real problem. You've all heard this too. People say, well, there is no truth. And the immediate response is that true? Right? That's 101 basic logic. It will astound you how many people don't get that. I guarantee you. You'll think, well, everybody understands that when you say there is no truth, that you're speaking nonsense because you're making a truth claim. It's amazing how many people will say that. There's no truth. Okay. It's like I related, I don't know about here in Corvallis, but in Eugene we have all these bumper stickers. Question authority. And someday I'm going to do this. I'm going to, depending on who's driving the car. I want to park next to them and say, I have a question about your bumper sticker. It says question authority. Can I ask you by what authority you're telling me to question authority? And I want to question your authority to say question authority. Right? Because everybody, it drives me nuts. And then third, which I've hinted at already, what atheists, especially those who would really call themselves, hardcore atheists, Christians are, choose one. Stupid, superstitious, irrational, illogical, emotional, infantile. They have a need. They got to have a crutch, right? And again, here's another, to kind of reiterate this point. Ignatius Press, who was I think he was actually a convert from atheism back in the mid-20th century. He says that although they intending to be absolute, modern atheism is, first of all, an anti-Christian attitude. It is, in fact, the Christian religion, which almost all atheists see as the obstacle to their idea of man's happiness. I would just say that in recent years, recent decades, there's also been kind of a reaction by many atheists to some degree against, Islam, really strong or even radical Islam, that they've kind of lumped. And that's the thing you see too, right? All religions are violent and evil and nasty. That's a broad one you see too. And then you point to certain, like acts of radical Islam and so forth to prove that point. But it's very true. Atheism has historically been very much about a reaction to Christianity, and there's a lot behind that. But that comes through again and again and again. Okay. So what I have up here actually is has to do with atheism. I think when push comes to shove, there's three questions I have if you're talking to an atheist. The first one is why? Why does anything exist? By the way, I got a lot of compliments on my handwriting last week. Thank you. Why does anything exist? Actually, this comes apart from Chesterton, but this really just goes back to like St. Thomas Aquinas or the Great, or even going all the way back to, in the Old Testament, to the Book of Wisdom, which kind of touches on this. The question is not even how it came into being, it's just why does anything even exist in the first place? Atheists can't answer that. They can't answer it. Because for something to come into existence that didn't before exist, there had to be some kind of power that could actually bring something out of nothing. And scientifically, by what we can do in a laboratory, we can't prove that. We can't show that, right? So there has to be a philosophical or theological explanation behind that, right? Secondly, what then is the meaning of anything? What I find with atheists, and I see this in reading things by Hitchens or Sam Harris or whatever, is they assume a lot of things without actually addressing them. If everything comes about by blind random chance and is purely material, then what is the meaning of meaning? How do we come up with a concept that something means something? How do we come up with a concept like love or sacrifice? Or why would we do things that are irrational, like give our life for somebody else? Why, what is the meaning behind meaning? We assume there has to be a meaning. So what I find, to put it another way, is that atheists or skeptics will assume that there has to be meaning. But why? Why? There shouldn't be. Logically, based on if it truly is material, there should be no meaning at all. Right? And they'll say, well, we create our own meaning. But even then, they assume that it has to exist, right? Because nobody gets up in the morning saying, there's no purpose to life, there's absolutely no reason to get up, there's nothing to do, but I'm still going to do it, just because. We have to assume there's some reason to live, right? to do what we do. And then finally, how can we know anything? This ties in closely with the second one. The question of epistemology. How can we know? Especially good, evil, etc. Moral reality, right? You know, Kevin, the atheist and freethinker who acknowledges that God exists, just not my God, even though the God he describes is not the God that I believe in, but we'll set that aside. Notice when I read that quote to you, how everything was based around a moral premise, right? He's so horrible, he's mean, he's evil. Why? Because he's doing horrible things. Well, why do you think all those things are horrible? If there's no purpose to life, how do you get off on saying that what God is doing is wrong? Because you have no basis to stand on. You're just a material, biological accident, a clump of cells standing in front of me, ranting about how God, who doesn't exist, is nasty and mean. How does that work out exactly, right? So what I'm saying, you know, in short, is there's an inherent irrationality when you really dig deep into atheism. Again, this is very cursory, but I want to give you a sense of the problems logically, some of the basic problems. Deeply irrational and deeply oriented towards rebuking God, trying to defy God rather than deny that he even exists. All right, okay.